Now, when we compare how the French decolonized to how the British decolonized, the French fought hard. I mean, really hard. I mean, really, really hard. Like, when we think about French Algeria, that was an 8 year long war. When we think about Indochina, like, we think about pretty much 1945, or like at very least 1946 to 1954. So, again, another 8 year war. The French were defeated in Indochina, in Dien Bien Phu, and only then did they decide to leave. Then you had the war with Algeria. Brutal, brutal war, yeah, like, well, at least 1 million Algerians died. When we think about the British, 1947, they locked up Gandhi quite a lot of times. You know, there's the Amritsar massacre in 1919, but there wasn't like that same level of like brutal like fighting tooth and nail for it. Even though India was the jewel in Britain's crown, even people like Churchill were like, no, we're not going to send in the troops for this. India ended up being given its independence in 1947. Indian independence already was a very, very bloody like kind of thing in terms of the aftermath of it, because of partition. You know, 1 million people died because India was split between like India and Pakistan and what's modern day Bangladesh. The borders were drawn along religious lines, but other than that, the British weren't stuck like fighting a brutal guerrilla campaign in India for all those years. If we compare that to how the French Empire would have gone, the French would not have given up their jewel of the crown, because when we see how they fought over their jewels of the crown, like Indochina, like Algeria, they fought hard for it. People like Gandhi, people like Nehru, people like Jinnah would have just been rounded up and shot more likely than not, because the French wouldn't have like tolerated like mass kind of disturbance in that way. Would French rule been better than British rule? In some ways it would have. At the same time, don't expect India to have got its independence anytime soon, because if we look at France even today, it's like a helicopter parent. It doesn't let go, basically. If you look at like French West Africa, its currency is still pegged to the euro, because the Central African franc and the West African franc, I believe, all the countries that used to be French colonies, their currency is directly controlled from Paris. Even nowadays, if there's a government that comes in any of these countries, if it's not a pro-French government, the French very quickly will send in troops or will do a coup to kick them out. The former president of Gabon, I believe, he famously said the quote of, "We are the car and France is the driver." So that gives you an idea of just how the French do not let go of their colonies, even today in 2020. Although most people watching this now will be 2021 or later period, whatever. You get what I'm saying. Like, the French just won't quit. How would this difference of the French controlling India have been compared to the British? Like, how would it have impacted geopolitics? During British rule, you end up having the so-called Great Game with Russia. Russia's coming in from the north and was like taking like Central Asia, and Britain was coming up from the south. Afghanistan, like Britain fought 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, and this was partly to do with making sure that whatever government was in Kabul was at least friendly to the British, so that the Russians wouldn't get too much influence. And many of those conflicts were very, very disastrous for the British. People still haven't learned the lessons of history that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, yeah, and anyone who goes there, whether it's the Americans, the Soviets, the British, anyone, they won't win there. A big part of why Anglo-Russian relationships during the 19th century weren't that great was because of the tensions of this, because of the tensions of the Russian bear being able to kind of sweep down and like take all of British India. This was the big fear. Whether the Russians would be able to do that or not, that was still the big concern. You know, if you think about why were the British involved in the Crimean War, is because the Russians were planning on taking over bits of like Turkey and like Istanbul or Constantinople in those days. Part of that was because the Russians, if they had that, would have then had a strategic naval bases in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that would have impacted Suez, which is obviously a very key thing for the British to keep control over, because obviously that was the main artery, that was the main trading route, which saved a lot of time having to instead of having to go around like South Africa and like the whole and coming all the way back up to India. Instead, you could just go and cut through the Suez Canal. It saved a lot of time. That's why the British were in Egypt. That's why the British were in Sudan. Yeah, and they fought many like hard conflicts in Sudan. Again, partly really to do with this. Even like the British and the French, they almost had a skirmish in, I think, Fashoda, I think it's how you pronounce it, in the 1890s. And again, it was to do with ensuring that Britain can maintain control over this kind of like this pipeline. The North African campaign, like kind of in World War II, was tied up with this. The war with the Ottoman Empire in World War One was tied up with this. It was ensuring that no matter what, this access to the East, like kind of was maintained. Even if you think about the Suez Crisis, again, if Britain didn't have colonies in the East, why would it have necessarily needed to have control over the Suez? It probably wouldn't have. Maybe in some regards it would have, but considering that the Suez Canal was built by the French and the French already had a lot of interest in there, would they have necessarily gone there? Probably not. In all of this, we have to really think about just how fundamentally it would have shifted Britain's foreign policy around the world. And also as well, how different countries view them. So a big part of why Britain ended up going into World War One is because the Kaiser, who was the grandson of Queen Victoria, he was very, very jealous of the British Empire and about their strong navy and about their possessions in India. He ended up starting a naval race, like a naval arms race with the British, which obviously the British ended up winning. That really soured Anglo-German relationships, which meant that England then ended up joining in the Triple Entente with France and Russia to be able to contain Germany. Now, if there hadn't been a British Empire in India, he might have been less likely to have tried to outcompete the British in that way. If France already had like possession of India, then Franco-German like kind of relationships would have continued to be sour, and the big competitor of Kaiser Wilhelm would have been France. They might not have built such a large navy, which then wouldn't have antagonized the British, which then might not have dragged Britain into World War One. So again, we can consider all the ramifications of that, and we'll probably do a future video on that. Although Alternative History Hub and What If Alt This have covered those scenarios extensively, and I think they'll probably have done a better job than I could probably do. I might try at a certain point, but I think that they've covered all bases from what I can see. But you know what else I can see? I can see people watching this who haven't subscribed, who haven't liked, haven't written a comment. Who's knocking on the door? Shh. Can't be interrupting my plug like that. Anyway, like, comment and subscribe, hit me up, like let me know how great I am or how terrible I am, whatever. But like, hopefully you've enjoyed these videos. Definitely check out the other alternative history ones. We've got a whole much more planned. I did say in the last one that I was gonna do about like the what if America suddenly went into civil war. We're going to do that, like, that's gonna be the next video after this. But I thought that rather than kind of like jumping between British Empire kind of themed ones and the American one, we're gonna like stick with this and then get that over the way with. So and also, as you can see, I'm no longer a COVID refugee, which is good. I moved out like by the time of filming this, I moved out like a week ago, like so I'm back home now, and I've actually set this up. It's no longer in my kitchen, it's now in my bedroom. So from the comfort of my thing, I'm wearing shorts here. You all can't even see this. I'm wearing shorts right now, right? I'm comfortable. I'm in my bedroom. Jeez. Anyway, like, so now no more boiler problems. Probably is going to be other problems that I can't foresee at the moment, such as the sticky tape there is not like great for some reason. It's not sticking on the wall. Backlight there probably might be a bit too harsh in there. We'll see when the editing comes out. But in the meantime, hope you really enjoyed this video. Now we're going to jump back in it. Now, considering this video has been talking about India, we haven't actually touched much on how Britain not being there would have affected India. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to really drill down into the data. That some of this is going to be quite heavy. What we have to think about is, what have the Romans ever done for us as such? What did the British ever do for India? This topic is very, very divisive. If you see this online, like, Indians were not very pleased with obviously being ruled for like 100 years or so. No country wants to be ruled by another. So obviously people are gonna feel a certain type of way about it and stuff. I'm certainly not a cheerleader for the empire. Like, kind of watch my other videos about it. I don't think it makes any level of sense to say that you're a liberal empire. That's a contradiction term. That's an oxymoron. As I said in previous videos, so check those out. I think that Britain would have been better if it never had an empire. But we're going to look at like the impact that Britain did have in India. So first of all, they did build some things. They did do some things that were good. They did build, for instance, the largest irrigation system in the whole world at that point, and that obviously improved the lives of many, many people. They also did build the railroads, which obviously India is now famous for. At the same time, everything we kind of say, we have to kind of say with a caveat, because all these things which were done for India weren't done done for benevolent reasons. As we said before, the British Empire's whole thing was making money, making it easy for British businesses and British people to operate in these countries. So the railways were not built for the benefit of regular Indian people. It was built so that the colonial administrators could obviously get from A to B, and also for the resources and stuff of India to get to the ports and then to be shipped to Britain. And also as well, it meant that obviously the personnel and a lot of the experts who were part of that system, a lot of the engineers, Indians were kept out of a lot of these things, and so it's quite difficult for Indian companies, for Indian professionals, to want to be able to actually work in these sectors. Again, it wasn't this kind of benevolent thing let's just build railways for people and stuff. It was tied in with this wider reason for having an empire. If we look at how India grew under the British Empire, from 1850 to 1947, India's GDP grew by 70%. So that averages 0.55% per annum. That's not great. That's pretty much stagnant growth over a period of almost 100 years. However, what we have to kind of bear in mind is this, right? How was India governed beforehand? In the period between 1700 and 1850, Indian GDP grew by an average of about 0.22%. That's not great. That's 39% over a period of 150 years. And you say, well, the East India Company was there, and they stole a lot of the land then, and they were exploited, etc., etc. Okay, cool. How about the period from 1600 to 1700, where it was basically run by the Moguls and other kind of princely states? Yeah, it grew by 0.2%. Most societies around the world, most cultures around the world, didn't see whole level of growth, economic growth. This modern notion we have of things always getting better, of technology always improving, standard of living always rising. Yeah, it's a concept which is about 250 years old, and it coincides with the Industrial Revolution. Before the Agricultural Revolution, which then led to the Industrial Revolution, that wasn't a thing anywhere in the world. People were born poor and you died poor. People didn't suddenly become super wealthy and stuff. There wasn't this kind of entrepreneurial spirit. People weren't looking. They weren't economists. They're going oh, the GDP has gone up by 2%. That just wasn't a thing. It was stagnant, right? If you look at the period between 1850 to 1947, the GDP per capita in India rose from $533 in 1990 international dollars terms. So 533. I'm really messing up my numbers now. 533 to 618. So that's almost negligible. That's a tiny jump. Yeah, that's almost no growth at all. However, obviously, so people kind of point now and say, oh, India's growing at a rapid pace, and this shows that India was better, obviously being run by the Indians. But again, most of that growth has been in the last 30 years, when India has liberalized its economy and has actually opened itself up for international trade, because the standard thing for India has kind of just been stagnant growth for many centuries, if not at least many centuries. So people often point to the fact that in 1870 India made up 16% of the world GDP, and by 1947 it was at just 4%. So people often point to that and go, see, the British stole lots of wealth, not recognizing that the pie expands. As we said before, economics is not a zero-sum thing. It's not about slices of pizza being stolen by one person so that someone else can't have. It doesn't mean the economy grows, and this is something known as the Great Divergence. Western capitalist industrialized nations suddenly shot up and far exceeded all the rest of the world. That's the main reason. It's called the Great Divergence, because all other countries in the world, all other civilizations, just continued to stagnate, whereas Western Europe and its offshoots just suddenly went boom. And as a result of that, that's why Britain, a tiny little island of 47 million people, was able to outcompete India, which had almost 300 million people. It's because of this innovation, because of this new technology, because of this industrialization. Does this mean that the Indians were just lazy or something? No, it doesn't mean that. The British had a lot of control over what things the Indians can do. So the British bought things off the Indians for cheap, but and sold it to their market. But the Indian companies weren't able to sell to Britain because they had heavy levels of taxes put on them, etc., etc. So there was a lot of restrictive practices. At the same time, the British often used the same tax policies that the the local administrators, yeah, like had themselves, like you know, the local princely states, yeah, the local rulers within India, they also had many of these practices beforehand. The Mughals had these practices beforehand. The British kind of just did a continuation of what had already been in place. Maybe they might have put a few more restrictions, but realistically, it wasn't like that much. Actually, an interesting story I found when I was doing research for this is the story of Tartar Steel. So everyone knows about Tartar Steel. Well, not everyone knows, but the people who know about this stuff. Tartar Steel is a very famous like Indian steelmaking company. But how they got started was the father of it. I'm gonna butcher his name. Jamsetji Tata. Yeah, right. So he was involved in the textile industry. Yeah. So you know, obviously getting cotton and turning it into clothes and different like fabrics and cloths and stuff. However, the British says no, we don't need that. We need heavy industry. So because of that, he kind of ended up having to get into the steel industry, and because of that, Tata Steel is now so like large that actually a few years ago there's a steel production plant somewhere in I believe Wales, and actually it was bought out by Tata Steel. The tables have turned in a weird way. Yeah, so it's like now Indian companies are buying up former British companies and making a profit out of them. So it's interesting like kind of how things kind of like turn. But I think that this kind of like this argument that oh India was like held down by the British and like it would have suddenly become this booming like kind of like behemoth like if it weren't for British rule. The data doesn't seem to bear that out. Like yes, maybe if they had adopted the right practices, but regardless of who's running you, if the people running you are not doing smart economic policies, then your economy is going to stagnate no matter what. Whether the British rule you or you rule you, if people are not putting in these kind of like market friendly policies, your economy is not going to grow. And finally, the last thing we'll say on this is Napoleon. What happens to Napoleon? Well, if the British had lost in the Battle of Plassey and Wandiwash, I think I said it right now, then more likely than not, the French, they still probably would have lost the 7 Years' War, so it's a thing of, would there have been a French Revolution? Probably. The fact that they lost Canada in our timeline anyway, plus the Indian colonies, it meant that France had spent a lot of money on all these wars and had nothing to show for it, and this was a contributing factor to the French Revolution. But at the same time, I think that people kind of often kind of skate over the fact of actually Napoleon still would have existed, and he still would have been a great general. So there's nothing to say that, for instance, if there had been future wars, if Napoleon had risen to the ranks of being a great general, who's to say there might not have been a French king, but with Napoleon as his like top general and stuff? Who knows? Yeah, they probably wouldn't have had the same level of control as Napoleon, and obviously that has so many butterfly effects. But that's a whole separate video in and of itself, and there's been endless amount of alternative history videos which have like focused on that. So for the sake of this video, we'll end the timeline here, and yeah, thank you, and I hope that you really enjoyed it. We are going to cover a lot more, like we said. Stay tuned for the one on what if America suddenly went into civil war like now, like in the present day. And yeah, have a great day and bye.